The night air was thick with the scent of grease and spilled beer. Tasha's hands trembled as she wiped down the last table in the corner of the dimly lit diner, the clink of dishes echoing in the quiet after-hours stillness. A slow night, but it didn't matter. Her shift was almost over. She barely noticed the group of men at the far booth, their raucous laughter a distant hum until one of them caught her eye. "You know, it's funny," said one of them, his words slurring together as he leaned back in his seat, eyes fixed on Tasha. "They let people like her serve, but she's too dumb to run a business. Bet she doesn't even know how to count." The others chuckled, the sound ringing in her ears like a bell. Tasha swallowed, her heart pounding in her throat. She had heard it all before. The low whispers, the hidden smirks, the backhanded compliments. She'd spent years pretending it didn't hurt, pretending it was just noise. But tonight something inside her snapped. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I think you've had enough," she said, voice calm but steady, every word deliberate. The tension in her voice cut through the air, sharper than the knife she'd just used to slice open a bag of frozen fries. The man's eyes narrowed. He sneered at her, then spoke with a venomous calm. "Get back to work, slave. You don't want to test me." In that moment, she felt a surge of something fierce rising in her chest. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. Tasha pulled her phone from her apron pocket and dialed the number she knew would change everything. Her finger hovered over the screen for just a second, a breath held in time. The call connected. "Hello." The voice on the other end was tired but sharp. "This is Tasha Greene," she said, her voice now a weapon, "and I'm ready to make my statement." The room seemed to hold its breath as the men watched her, uncomprehending, as the wheels of fate began to turn. The hum of the diner's neon lights buzzed softly overhead, a low, constant sound that filled the silence of the late-night shift. Tasha Greene wiped down the last table in the corner, her movements automatic, muscles sore from hours of standing. The air smelled of grease and stale coffee, but she had long stopped noticing it. Her shift was nearly over, and all she wanted was to lock up and go home, to slip into the quiet of her apartment and forget about the world for a few hours. The diner's closing time was only minutes away, but a group of men still lingered at the booth by the window, laughing too loud for the hour, their glasses half full with beer. Tasha moved to clear their plates, her feet dragging slightly with every step. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called, his voice thick with alcohol. He leaned back in the booth, eyes locking onto hers. "You know, it's funny, isn't it? People like you serving in a place like this, but probably don't even know how to run a real business." Tasha's stomach twisted. Her fingers tightened around the plate she was holding, but she didn't let her gaze falter. She had heard it all before, these quiet slights, these whispered insults. But tonight the weight of it was different. She felt her jaw set, a deep breath rushing into her lungs as she forced a smile. "I think you've had enough," she said, her voice steady but sharp, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. She wasn't sure where the confidence had come from, but there it was, steady in her chest. "I'm asking you to pay your bill and leave." The man, a stocky figure with a thick neck and a thick mustache, chuckled darkly. His friends joined in, their laughter like nails scraping across her skin. He sat forward, looking her up and down with a mocking grin. "You hear that, boys? She thinks she can tell us what to do. Look at her, she's just a server. What does she even know?" The air seemed to shift around her. The way they looked at her, the way their eyes narrowed and sneered, wasn't just casual disdain. It was something darker, something deeper. They didn't see her as a person, just a servant. A body meant to fill their coffee cups and clear their plates. Tasha bit down on the sting of their words. She had been called worse. She'd learned a long time ago to swallow the bitterness, to let the insults roll off her like water. But tonight something inside her snapped. Her hand tightened on the plate in her grip, her fingers going white. "I don't want any trouble," she said quietly, though her voice still held a hard edge. "You don't." The man leaned back with a grin that was anything but friendly. Too bad because you've got it now. The words hung in the air like a threat. Tasha felt her chest tighten. She could feel the sweat begin to bead on her forehead. This wasn't just another comment. This wasn't just another joke. She didn't move. I don't want any trouble, but you're not going to treat me like this. Her voice was almost a whisper, but it held a strength that made him pause. The room, for just a moment, felt as though it had stopped spinning. Her breath came in slow, measured pulls. He smirked, clearly amused. What are you gonna do about it? Go run to your boss. You really think anyone cares about a girl like you? The words landed heavy in her chest, suffocating, but she didn't flinch. She could feel it, the weight of years of this kind of treatment, the oppressive feeling of being seen as less, as nothing, but she would not let him see it. Tasha pulled out her phone, and for the first time that night, the cool glass felt like an anchor in her hand. She held it steady, her finger hovering over the screen. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, the sound louder than the buzzing of the neon lights. She dialed the number she knew would change everything. She had to do it. No more silence. No more pretending. The phone rang once. Then a voice, tired but sharp, answered. Hello. Tasha's throat felt tight. She cleared it, then spoke with the determination she didn't know she still had. This is Tasha Greene, she said, the words a quiet declaration. And I'm ready to make my statement. Her gaze never left the group of men at the booth. The laughter died, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The man with the thick neck, the one who had been sneering at her only moments before, blinked in confusion. He didn't understand. He didn't know that this moment, the moment when she picked up the phone, when she finally spoke, was going to unravel everything. Tasha felt a strange calm wash over her. The choice had been made. There was no going back now. As she spoke with the lawyer on the other end, her eyes never wavered from the group of men. Their smug expressions faltered just a little, but Tasha wasn't watching for that. She was watching for something else. Quiet change. The shift that had already begun. The days following Tasha's phone call felt like a blur. The initial rush of adrenaline had faded, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that she couldn't shake. She had made the decision, but the weight of it, the enormity of what she was about to face, pressed down on her shoulders. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that maybe she should have stayed silent. Maybe, just maybe, it would have been easier to keep her head down, endure the jabs and the sneers, and go home to her small apartment at the end of each shift. But she couldn't go back. Not now. The lawyer, Jake Matthews, was a man of few words. His calm demeanor both reassuring and intimidating. He had told her that they would need evidence. More than just her word. She didn't understand how much more until she saw the stack of papers he handed her during their meeting. The paperwork was intimidating, filled with forms to fill out, questions that asked for specifics she wasn't sure she could remember. But she had to. She had to recall every incident, every hurtful comment, every small betrayal. The smallest details could make or break her case. You've got a strong case, but we need proof, Jake had said. His tone businesslike but with a hint of empathy. Witnesses, video footage, anything you've got. It felt like a mountain, one she didn't know how to climb. But she was determined to try. Tasha sat in the small, cluttered office across from Jake. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the piles of paperwork. Her stomach churned as she flipped through the forms. Some of them asked for the names of people who had witnessed the abuse. Others asked for dates, times, and descriptions of incidents. Incidents that she had long buried in the recesses of her memory, each one a scar she'd learned to hide behind a forced smile. She closed her eyes, breathing in deeply as she let the memories flood back. It wasn't the first time this had happened, not by a long shot. It had started when she was just a child, back in middle school, when the white kids at school would call her Black Barbie or worse. They never let her forget that she was different, that she didn't belong. She could still hear the laughter, the sharp words, the way they would look at her like she was something less. But it wasn't just in school. It had followed her. These subtle, often insidious moments that had become a constant in her life. There was the time she had been passed over for a promotion at a call center job, despite having better qualifications than the white woman who had been hired instead. There were the times she had been asked if she could speak proper, or been told to tone it down when she was just being herself. Now those same dynamics were playing out in the diner. Jake's voice pulled her from her reverie. "Tasha, talk to me. What's the first thing you remember at the diner?" Her fingers tightened on the pen. "The first thing," she echoed, trying to push away the swirling memories. "The first time you felt something wasn't right." Tasha bit her lip. It wasn't hard to recall. She had worked at the diner for 2 years, but the memory she needed to share had come just 6 months ago. It was a slow afternoon, and the diner was nearly empty. She had been cleaning up a table when a couple had walked in. They were regulars, friendly enough. But this time, the husband had looked at her in a way that made her stomach twist. "Sweetheart, you sure you want to be serving us? You look like you'd be better off somewhere else," he had said. His smile so wide it bordered on creepy. His wife had giggled nervously, but Tasha could see the discomfort in her eyes too. They weren't joking. "Not really. I'm fine where I am," Tasha had replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though her hands had trembled slightly. "Aha," the man had said, his tone laced with condescension. "You're a hard worker. I'll give you that. Just don't know why someone like you would want to do this job, you know." Tasha had forced a smile, but every word from him had stung like a slap. She had told herself that it wasn't worth her time to react. They were just ignorant people who didn't know any better. But she knew deep down it was more than that. It always was. "Tell me more," Jake prodded, snapping her back to the present. "What about the guys from the other day? The ones who made the comments?" Her stomach turned. She closed her eyes briefly. "They always do that," she said, her voice quieter now. "The ones who come in drunk, thinking they can say whatever they want. But it wasn't just that. It was the way they looked at me. The way they dismissed me like I wasn't even a person, just a tool to be used." Jake nodded, scribbling something down on the legal pad in front of him. "And Mrs. Pierce, the owner of the diner." Tasha shifted uncomfortably. "She's no better," she muttered, her voice tinged with bitterness. "She lets them get away with it. She always has. She'll tell me to just ignore it, that it's part of the job. Don't rock the boat, she says. You've got to be a professional. But it's not professional to let them disrespect you." Jake didn't reply immediately, but she could tell he was thinking, piecing it all together. The case was bigger than just those men at the booth. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a pattern, and it ran deep. "Okay," he said after a long pause, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll start gathering more evidence. There's got to be more people who've seen things, heard things. The more we have, the stronger your case will be." Tasha nodded, though the weight of what she was about to do began to sink in. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all the people who had ever been told to be quiet, to stay in their place. She was fighting for the dignity she had been denied, for the people who would never have the courage to speak out. As Jake left her to finish the paperwork, Tasha took a deep breath, the bitter taste of what lay ahead settling in her chest. There was no turning back now. But she was ready. Ready to fight, ready to make her voice heard, ready to make them listen. She just hoped it would be enough. The phone calls started a few days after Tasha's meeting with Jake. First, they were anonymous. Silent, empty calls that rang through the diner's landline late at night, when the place was still and the kitchen was closed. Tasha would pick up, her breath caught in her throat, but the line would go dead after a single ring. At first, she dismissed them. Nothing to worry about, right? Just prank callers. But then came the messages. One morning, while she was tying her apron before the lunch rush, she found a slip of paper tucked under the front door. Her heart sank when she saw what was written in thick, block letters. "You should have kept your mouth shut, bitch." Tasha's hands shook as she read it, her fingers gripping the paper until it was wrinkled and creased. She wanted to crumple it up and throw it away, but she couldn't. Something inside her told her this was the beginning of something bigger, something darker. She folded the note carefully, slipping it into her pocket as she forced a shaky breath, trying to steady her nerves. Her first instinct was to tell Jake, but when she reached for her phone, the screen lit up with another message. This one was from an unknown number. If you don't stop, we'll make sure you regret it. Consider this a warning. Her stomach turned. She couldn't breathe for a moment. She didn't know what to make of it. Was it just an idle threat? Or something worse? She'd faced her share of taunts, jokes, and disrespect, but this felt different. This felt real. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything she had started. She had to stay strong no matter what. The threats didn't stop there. They escalated, each one more personal and unnerving than the last. Tasha started noticing things at work. Small, unsettling details. Her car tires had been flattened one morning when she left for her shift. The air smelled faintly of smoke, like someone had been near it, close enough to leave a faint residue of burning rubber. A part of her wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but deep down she knew. It wasn't a coincidence. Tasha didn't tell anyone at work. She couldn't risk it. What if the staff was involved? What if the manager, Mrs. Pierce, knew about the threats and was turning a blind eye? She couldn't take the chance. So she dealt with it alone. Every time something new happened, she shoved it down, buried it under the weight of what was already on her shoulders. The case, the fear, the stress. But one night it all came crashing down. It was late, just an hour before closing time, when a man in a hoodie walked into the diner. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down at the counter and waited. Tasha glanced over at him, noting the strange, unsettling aura he gave off, the way he seemed to blend into the shadows. He was watching her. She could feel his eyes on her, even though he hadn't spoken a word. She tried to focus on her work, but it was hard. His gaze lingered. Every time she moved, she could feel him watching, and she knew that something wasn't right. Her anxiety started to creep in again, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. Was this one of the men who had been sending her the messages? Was he here to warn her, or worse, threaten her in person? The bell above the door rang, and Tasha looked up, hoping for a distraction. The man in the hoodie didn't move. Instead, he slowly slid his hand across the counter, as if to leave something for her. Tasha hesitated for a moment, but the curiosity, combined with the knot in her stomach, drove her to walk over. As she approached, the man looked up at her. His eyes were obscured by the shadows of the hoodie, but she could see a faint smirk beneath the fabric. He didn't say anything. Tasha slowly leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. There, sitting in front of her, was another piece of paper, folded neatly. Tasha's heart pounded as she took the note. She unfolded it quickly, not daring to waste a second. It was a picture. A black and white photo, grainy and blurry. But the subject was clear. It was of her car, her parked car, taken from across the street. "You're being watched." Her hands trembled as she stared at the photo. Her mind raced with the implications. They knew where she lived. They were watching her every move she made. The thought of it sent a chill down her spine, freezing her in place. But just as she was about to react, the man in the hoodie stood up and walked out, without a word. His presence was so quiet, so efficient, that Tasha barely had time to process the terror that flooded her system. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. Not now. She had come too far, and no matter what they did, no matter how many threats they sent, she wasn't going to back down. Tasha took a deep breath, pushing back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed Jake. When he answered, his voice was low, concerned. "Tasha, I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I know," Jake said softly. "But we're in this together. You're not alone in this fight." But as Tasha ended the call, she wasn't sure if she believed him. She didn't know how much further they would go, how far the threats would escalate. One thing was certain. Her fight had just begun. And it was only going to get harder from here. The trial had started with such promise. Jake had spoken with the confident tone of a man who'd seen many cases like hers, and for a moment, Tasha had felt a glimmer of hope. They had gathered the evidence, the notes, the pictures, the witness statements. They had even convinced a former employee of the diner, Marcus, to testify. Marcus had been the one who had overheard the racist comments from the men in the booth, the ones that had shattered her last ounce of dignity. But as the case moved forward, that hope started to slip away like sand between her fingers. The courtroom was sterile, cold, and harsh. The bright fluorescent lights above cast sharp shadows, illuminating the small details, the scribbling of pens on notepads, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of the jury. It felt like a far cry from the warmth of the diner, the place where she had lived for so long, a place where she'd never been allowed to truly be herself, to truly speak out. And now, here in this room, it felt even colder, more distant. The first day of the trial had been focused on presenting the evidence. Jake had shown the jury the threatening notes, the pictures, the statements from witnesses. Tasha had testified about the constant microaggressions, the time she had been belittled by customers and co-workers alike, the way she had been treated as invisible, as less than human. But as the trial dragged on, the defense team began to tear her apart, piece by piece. The first salvo came from the defense attorney, a slick, smooth-talking man named Richard Alston, who seemed to have a talent for making people doubt their own words. He stood before the jury with a kind of air of superiority that made Tasha's stomach churn. His voice deep and calculated. "Tasha Greene claims she was harassed," he began, his eyes scanning her as though she were an object to be scrutinized. But, as we can all see from the evidence presented, these threatening notes were nothing more than an expression of frustration. The kind of thing you might expect when someone is upset. No one can prove that these notes were linked to the diner, or that any of the customers who've been named in this case are guilty of harassment. Miss Greene has built an entire case on assumptions and anger, not facts. The words stung more than she had anticipated. Her grip on the chair tightened. She had spent so much of her life learning to silence herself, learning to take whatever people threw at her. But this was different. This wasn't just a simple insult or a slight. This was an attack on everything she had worked for, the dignity, the voice she had fought to find. Jake stood next to her, a quiet force of reassurance, but even he seemed rattled by the defense's quick ability to undercut her testimony. "Miss Greene," Alston continued, "is it not true that you have a history of misunderstanding certain situations?" Tasha froze. The air in the room felt thick. Alston's eyes gleamed as he pressed on. "Perhaps you misinterpreted these incidents. Perhaps you're not as objective as you think. After all, you've worked in that diner for years, enduring rude comments and offhand remarks from customers. Isn't it possible that you're overreacting?" Tasha felt the blood drain from her face. She had expected resistance, but not this kind of calculated, insidious attack. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about her, her character, her integrity. And the longer he spoke, the more she began to question herself. Was she overreacting? Were these things really that bad? Had she really blown them out of proportion? Alston's questioning was relentless, designed to wear her down, to make her second-guess everything she had experienced. It was the kind of mental manipulation that sent a deep unease into her gut. She wanted to fight back, to scream, to defend herself, but the doubt was already settling in. But then came the turning point, the moment when the tide shifted. Came when Marcus took the stand. He had been a former cook at the diner, a big man with a quiet demeanor who had worked there for a few years before leaving to find another job. He had never been the kind of person to make waves, but when Tasha had reached out to him, he had agreed to testify. He had been a witness to many of the incidents she had experienced, the racial slurs, the degrading remarks. He wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't some seasoned courtroom veteran. He was just a man who had seen something wrong and had the courage to speak up. As he sat on the witness stand, his hands folded in his lap, he looked almost uncomfortable, like the whole thing was too much for him. But then he looked at Tasha, sitting in the front row of the courtroom, and something changed in his eyes. "I've seen it," Marcus said in his deep, gravelly voice. "I saw how they treated her. I saw how they'd look down at her, like she didn't matter. They'd make jokes. They'd talk about her behind her back, call her names. They didn't care about her. They didn't care about anyone. But Tasha, she kept working. She kept doing her job, even when they treated her like dirt." There was a long pause, and Marcus's words hung in the air like a weight, palpable and heavy. "She didn't deserve any of that," he continued, his voice steady now. "No one deserves that." Tasha felt a strange surge of something, relief maybe. Or was it gratitude? The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the courtroom feel less cold, less hostile. Alston tried to tear him apart, of course, questioning his credibility, his relationship with Tasha, trying to paint him as a disgruntled former employee. But Marcus stood firm. He didn't flinch. And something inside Tasha stirred. She had felt small, insignificant, like her experiences didn't matter. But now, as she looked around the room, she realized she wasn't alone. Marcus's testimony was a turning point, a crack in the defense's narrative. The doubts, the accusations, they began to unravel. Tasha knew the battle wasn't over. There would be more questions, more attacks on her character, but for the first time since this whole process had begun, she felt a spark of something else. Hope. Maybe she had been right all along. Maybe her voice mattered. Maybe, just maybe, she could win this. The fight wasn't over. But it was far from over. And Tasha was ready for what came next. The weeks after Marcus's testimony were filled with a tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. The courtroom had shifted. Tasha could feel it, even in the silence of the diner where she still worked, the place that had long felt like a cage. There was a buzz in the air, a feeling that something was on the verge of breaking. But it wasn't just the case that was weighing on her. It was everything else. The fallout from her decision to speak up, the way people looked at her now, the way her life had started to spiral. The diner felt different. Tasha had expected some of her regular customers to show their support, to acknowledge her courage. But instead, many of them had begun to distance themselves. There was an unspoken tension in the air, one that made her feel as though everyone was avoiding eye contact. It wasn't overt hostility, but the coldness was unmistakable. Mrs. Pierce, the owner of the diner, had been one of the first to retreat. The older woman no longer greeted Tasha with her usual tired smile or passing comment about the weather. Instead, Mrs. Pierce kept her distance, only speaking to her when necessary. The lines of communication had grown strained, and every conversation felt clipped, like a transaction rather than an interaction. One evening, during the dinner rush, Tasha was wiping down the counter when Mrs. Pierce approached her. Her steps slow and deliberate. "Tasha," she said, her voice low, almost apologetic. "You're making waves, and I'm not sure how much longer we can afford it. This whole case is bad for business, you know that, right?" Tasha looked up, her heart pounding. The words landed like a punch. "Bad for business?" she echoed, disbelief creeping into her voice. "You mean because of me? Or because of what they did to me?" Mrs. Pierce glanced around the room nervously, her gaze shifting as though she were afraid someone would overhear. "It's not about what happened," she muttered. "It's just the way things look. Customers don't want to come in here and feel uncomfortable. I've had people call in and cancel their reservations, people who've been coming here for years." Tasha's hands trembled around the rag in her grip. She could feel the sting of her boss's words, each one more humiliating than the last. "So, what, you want me to drop the case?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not saying that," Mrs. Pierce replied quickly. "But you have to understand the impact it's having. It's bad for everyone, Tasha. People are talking. You're putting all of us in a position we don't want to be in." Tasha opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't process what she was hearing. Had Mrs. Pierce really just said that? She had spent so many years swallowing her pride, holding her head high in the face of every small insult, every degrading comment, thinking that maybe one day she'd be treated with the respect she deserved. And now the owner of the place she had worked for, the one who had watched her grow, was telling her that her fight for justice was a threat. She clenched her jaw. "I'm not backing down. You should know that." Mrs. Pierce didn't respond. She just turned and walked away, her heels tapping against the linoleum floor. Tasha watched her retreat, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on her shoulders. The following days brought more of the same. Tasha's co-workers started acting like strangers. There were no more casual conversations in the back room, no more shared jokes during slow hours. The other servers began to avoid her. Her once close relationships with the kitchen staff became strained. They didn't speak to her directly, but their silences were more deafening than any harsh word. They made sure not to be seen talking to her, as if they were afraid the mere association would draw unwanted attention. The customers, too, had changed. Some looked at her with pity, their smiles thin and forced, as though they were afraid to make eye contact for too long. Others avoided her completely, sitting at booths far from the counter or silently passing her by without a word. The few who tried to speak to her gave her the kind of forced encouragement that made her want to retreat. "Hang in there, girl," one woman said to her as she picked up her check. But it wasn't a comfort. It was a reminder that the town had picked sides, and she was on the wrong one. Tasha could feel the isolation creeping in. The loneliness gnawed at her, a constant companion. She had thought the trial would bring some relief, some sense of justice, but instead it had brought division, backlash, and a deepening sense of alienation. But the worst blow came from her family. One night, after work, Tasha sat in her small apartment, scrolling through her phone when she saw a message from her mother. The text was brief, but it carried the weight of everything that had been unspoken for years. "I don't know what you're doing, but you're making things harder for yourself. People are talking. Your father's upset. Maybe it's time to stop." Tasha stared at the message, her heart sinking into her stomach. She had always known that her family wasn't exactly on her side when it came to issues of race, but to hear her mother, the one person who had always been there for her, suggest she stop hit harder than anything else. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She wanted to respond, to tell her mother that this wasn't just a phase, that she wasn't just going to walk away. But the words wouldn't come. The guilt settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. "Maybe it's time to stop," her mother had said. She tossed her phone aside, the anger rising in her chest, but even that anger felt like a distant thing. A small voice inside her whispered that maybe her mother was right, that maybe it was easier to just give up, to stop fighting. But the other voice, the one that had grown louder with every passing day, refused to let her. Tasha stood up, pacing across the room. She wasn't done. No matter what her family said, no matter how the town treated her, she couldn't give up now. The moment she stopped fighting, the moment she let them silence her, was the moment she lost everything. She had already come too far to turn back. And she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel ashamed for wanting to be treated like a human being. Tasha took a deep breath, wiping the tears from her eyes. This was bigger than her. This was about everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. She was going to see this through. And nothing could make her stop now. Tasha hadn't anticipated the media circus that followed. The trial was no longer just a legal battle. It was a spectacle. Headlines blared across local newspapers, then spread to regional outlets, and soon the national news. The story of a young woman suing a small-town diner for racial harassment became a flashpoint for debates on systemic racism, justice, and the cost of speaking out. She had wanted justice, but she hadn't expected this kind of attention, this kind of scrutiny. First, it was thrilling. Tasha had never imagined that something so personal, so painful, would be thrust into the public eye. But soon the attention became overwhelming. Cameras and reporters showed up outside the diner, forcing Mrs. Pierce to lock the doors during certain hours. Pickets and protests gathered outside the courthouse, some in support of Tasha, others against her. It was like the entire town had been divided into two sides. The ones who believed she was fighting for what was right and the ones who thought she was making things worse for everyone. Tasha tried to focus on the case, but it was hard to ignore the constant barrage of questions. As much as she tried to keep her distance from the media, they found her. They showed up at her apartment, following her through the streets of town, their cameras flashing as they shoved microphones in her face. She'd had enough of their questions. How does it feel to be the face of this movement? Do you think your case will change things, or is it just about revenge? Do you regret speaking out? She had never asked to be the face of anything. She was just a woman, a server at a diner, doing her best to survive in a world that constantly told her she wasn't enough. But now, her face was plastered on news sites, her words dissected and twisted into sound bites. Every time she stepped outside, she felt like she was on display. Her emotions, her pain, her humanity all laid bare for the world to pick apart. The hardest part was the isolation that came with it. The once familiar faces of her co-workers at the diner were now distant and cold. No one spoke to her unless absolutely necessary, and when they did, it was with forced politeness. Tasha no longer recognized the place that had once been her second home. It was as though she had become a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered about behind closed doors. Even her own family was beginning to pull away. Her mother, who had initially told her to stop, now wouldn't answer her calls. Her father had told her, in no uncertain terms, that she was making a spectacle of herself. He didn't understand why she was pushing so hard, why she couldn't just let it go. They had never been the most supportive of her ambitions, but this was different. They didn't see it as a fight for justice. They saw it as a fight for attention, a fight that would only bring more shame to their family. But in the midst of all this chaos, there was one person who remained steadfast: Jake. He wasn't just her lawyer. He was the one person who understood what this battle meant to her. Every time she wanted to give up, every time the pressure became too much, Jake was there to remind her why she couldn't. He became her anchor, a steady presence in the storm. On one particularly difficult day, after an especially grueling press conference, Tasha found herself sitting in her apartment, exhausted and drained. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Jake. She almost didn't open it. She wasn't sure she had the energy to read one more message about the case or the media storm surrounding her. But she opened it anyway. "I know it's tough, but remember why you're doing this. You're doing this for the people who can't speak up, for the ones who don't have a voice. And you're doing it for yourself too. You've come too far to turn back now." His words hit her like a wave. They were simple, but they reminded her of everything she had been fighting for. Not just for her own dignity, but for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or ignored. Tasha wiped the tears from her eyes, her fingers trembling as she typed a quick response. "Thanks, Jake. I needed that." She set her phone down and stared out the window. The noise of the world outside felt distant, muted. In that moment, the anger, the frustration, the exhaustion, all of it seemed to fade away. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let them break her. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. The trial continued, and so did the media frenzy. But Tasha learned to navigate it. Slowly, she began to speak to the reporters, her voice more confident, her answers more deliberate. She told her story not as a victim, but as a person who had had enough. Enough of the jokes. Enough of the slights. Enough of the silence. She wasn't going to let them dismiss her anymore. One day, after a particularly intense cross-examination in court, Tasha stepped out into the bright sunlight, her heart pounding in her chest. The courtroom doors opened, and a sea of reporters swarmed around her. The questions came fast, one after another. "Tasha, how do you respond to the claims that you're just seeking attention?" one reporter shouted. "Do you feel guilty for bringing so much publicity to the town?" another asked. Tasha took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about attention. This is about justice. It's about showing people that we have the right to be treated with respect, no matter where we work or where we come from. It's about speaking up when we've been silenced for too long." The words hung in the air for a moment, and for the first time in weeks, Tasha felt the weight of the media storm lift, just a little. She had found her voice again. And she wasn't going to let anyone take it away. As she walked away from the courthouse, reporters still shouting behind her, Tasha felt a surge of strength. The storm was far from over, but she knew that no matter how hard it got, she was ready for it. She had come too far to stop now. And the world was finally starting to hear her. The trial had reached its boiling point. Tasha sat in the courthouse, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the defense table. It had been weeks of grueling testimony, mounting pressure, and unrelenting attacks on her character. But now, as the closing arguments approached, she felt something shift deep inside her, an unshakable resolve. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with tension. The jury filed in, taking their seats in the wooden chairs that creaked under their weight. The spectators sat in silence, all eyes fixed on the lawyers, the two opposing sides now preparing to make their final statements. The final chapter of this long, drawn-out battle was about to unfold. Jake, her lawyer, stood up and adjusted his glasses before he turned to face the jury. His voice rang out with clarity, unwavering in the face of the opposition. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jake began, his tone measured but forceful, "this case is not just about one woman's experience. This case is about every person who has ever been silenced, dismissed, and made to feel less than human because of the color of their skin. It is about the systemic racism that exists in places that many people might not even see, but that every day, countless individuals endure." Tasha listened intently, her chest tightening as Jake spoke. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was something bigger. This was the fight for every person who had ever been marginalized, every voice that had been silenced. She was standing on the shoulders of those who had come before her, and she couldn't let them down. Jake continued, his words cutting through the heavy silence in the room. "The evidence has been presented. The witnesses have spoken. The threats have been documented. The microaggressions, the humiliation, these were not isolated incidents. These were part of a larger pattern of discrimination, of a culture that treats people like Tasha as less than equal. She has shown incredible bravery in speaking out. And now, it is time for this court to hold those responsible accountable." Tasha's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel every word Jake spoke resonating within her. This wasn't just about proving she had been wronged. It was about forcing the world to confront the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Even when it meant people like Mrs. Pierce, the very woman who had employed her, had to face the consequences of her inaction. Her complicity in the system of discrimination that had allowed this behavior to go unchecked. The defense attorney, Richard Alston, stood up next. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his suit jacket with practiced ease. Tasha had seen him work his magic throughout the trial, twisting her words and casting doubt on her integrity. But now, as he prepared to deliver his final argument, she felt something shift. This wasn't going to be another one of his performances. It wasn't going to be another attempt to discredit her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alston began, his voice smooth and insidious, "what we are dealing with here is not a case of racial discrimination. No, this is a case of personal grievance." Tasha Greene was upset about a few comments, mind you, that were not meant to cause harm. This is a woman who has chosen to twist her own personal experience into something bigger, something more sinister, when in fact, she has merely overreacted. Tasha's stomach churned as Alston spoke. His words were like daggers, designed to wound her, to make her feel small and insignificant. But she refused to let him. She was stronger than this. Stronger than his manipulation. She had fought too hard to let his lies define her. "Her claims," Alston continued, "are based on subjective experiences, on words that were misinterpreted. And now, she's attempting to drag an entire business into the mud, to destroy the livelihoods of hard-working people, all because she couldn't handle a few offhand comments." His words were designed to paint her as the villain, as the one who had overstepped, the one who had caused all this chaos. But Tasha knew better. This wasn't just about words. It was about the culture of silence that allowed those words to fester. It was about the system that protected people like him, the people who thought they could get away with anything. And now, for the first time in her life, Tasha had the power to change that. When Alston finished, he sat back down, and Tasha took a deep breath. Her chest was tight, her hands clammy, but she knew what she had to do. It wasn't just about defending herself anymore. It was about the bigger picture, the change that had to happen for others who were too afraid to speak up. When it was her turn to speak, Tasha stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the eyes in the room on her. She had spent years being invisible, being ignored, being dismissed. But now, she was standing in front of them, every ounce of strength she had gathered over the years rising within her. "I'm not here for revenge," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here because this has been my life. Every day, I've had to fight to be seen, to be heard. I've had to endure comments, insults, and treatment that no one should ever have to experience. And I've kept my head down, I've tried to ignore it, because that's what I was taught to do. But one day, I realized that I couldn't keep doing that anymore." Her voice was growing stronger with each word. "I am not here to tear down a business. I'm here to demand respect, for myself and for everyone who has ever been treated the way I've been treated. I am here because I deserve better. We all do." She paused, looking around the courtroom, making eye contact with the jury. "You don't get to silence me anymore. You don't get to make me feel small. I am not just a server. I am a human being. And I will not be erased." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For the first time in weeks, Tasha felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had said what needed to be said. She had spoken her truth. And no matter what happened next, she knew she had done the right thing. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Tasha felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had given everything she had in this fight. She had faced the fear, the doubt, the threats. And now it was out of her hands. The jury would decide. But whatever their verdict, Tasha knew that she had already won. She had taken her power back. She had made her voice heard. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The days after the trial were a blur, a mixture of relief and anxiety that weighed on Tasha like a blanket she couldn't shake off. The verdict had been handed down a week earlier. The jury had ruled in her favor. It had been a moment of victory, a moment she had fought for. But now that it was done, it felt almost unreal. She sat on the small balcony of her apartment, staring out at the city below. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the pavement. The world was moving on as it always did. But for Tasha, everything had changed. The diner had been forced to close for a time, its reputation irreparably damaged. Mrs. Pierce had been fined, and the men who had tormented her, the ones who had taunted her, belittled her, and made her life unbearable, had been publicly humiliated. The social media backlash was intense, and the community rallied behind Tasha, showing up at rallies, sharing their own stories of discrimination, and demanding accountability. For the first time in years, she felt like the town was listening to her. But the victory wasn't without its costs. She had lost her job, a place that had once been a steady source of income, a place where she had put in years of hard work. The familiar routine was gone, replaced by uncertainty. She had expected this, of course. She had known that standing up would come with consequences, but now that it was real, the weight of it was heavier than she had imagined. The phone rang, jolting Tasha out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening when she saw Jake's name flash across it. They hadn't spoken much since the trial. He'd been busy with other cases, and she'd been trying to figure out what to do next. "Hello," she answered, trying to sound calm, though her voice betrayed her. "Hey Tasha. It's Jake." His voice came through the line, warm and familiar. "I wanted to check in and see how you're doing." "I'm okay," she said, though the words felt hollow. "It's been a lot to process. I thought winning would feel different, but now that it's over I feel kind of lost." "That's completely normal," Jake said. "You did something huge. It's going to take time for everything to settle. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You stood up and you didn't back down. That's something most people would never have the courage to do." Tasha nodded, though she knew he couldn't see her. I didn't do it alone though. Had you? And everyone who supported me. I couldn't have done it without them. Jake was quiet for a moment, then he spoke again, his tone more serious. I've been thinking about your situation. I know you're looking for a new job, but I have a proposition for you. There's a non-profit I've been working with. An organization focused on racial justice and legal advocacy. They're looking for someone with your experience. Someone who understands what it's like to face discrimination firsthand. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. You're serious? I am, Jake said. They need someone who can relate to the people they're fighting for. Someone who isn't just talking about change but has lived it. I think you'd be perfect for the role. She sat back, her mind racing. A non-profit. Fighting for racial justice. It was a world she had never imagined stepping into, but in that moment, it felt like it was the right path. It felt like a way to take everything she had experienced and turn it into something positive, something that could help others who had been through what she had. I don't know, she said, her voice uncertain. I've never done anything like that. I don't even know where to start. I'll help you, Jake reassured her. You don't have to figure it out alone. This could be your new beginning. You've already taken the first step by speaking up. This is the next step. Tasha paused, looking out at the world beyond her balcony, watching the people walk by, oblivious to the fight she had just gone through. The idea of helping others, of using her voice to make a difference, it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. I'll think about it, she said, a hint of a smile creeping into her voice. Thank you, Jake. For everything. No problem, he said, his voice warm. I'm always here if you need anything. You've got this, Tasha. As she hung up the phone, Tasha sat back in her chair, taking a deep breath. The weight on her chest had eased just a little. She had a direction now, a purpose that stretched beyond the courtroom and the media circus. There was work to be done, real work. Work that would help others, work that would continue the fight for justice she had started. The following weeks passed in a blur of interviews and meetings, with Jake helping her navigate the job application process for the nonprofit. She found herself excited for the first time in a long while, stepping into a world where her voice, her experience, could actually create change. The nonprofit organization offered her a position as a community outreach coordinator, a role that would allow her to connect with individuals who had faced discrimination and offer them the legal support they needed. It was everything she had wanted, everything she had been fighting for, and it felt like a natural next step. On her first day at the nonprofit, Tasha sat in a small meeting room with a group of passionate individuals, all driven by the same goal: to fight for justice, to stand up for those who had been ignored. The energy in the room was palpable, the collective fire of their shared purpose igniting something deep within her. As she listened to the team discuss their upcoming projects, Tasha knew she was in the right place. She could see the impact she would have, the people she would help, the changes she could be part of. This wasn't just a job, it was a mission. Later that afternoon, as she walked out of the office, Tasha took a deep breath, the sun on her face, the weight of the past finally starting to lift. There was still work to be done. There would always be work to do. But for the first time, she felt like she was on the path to something bigger than herself. A new beginning. And this time she was ready for it. Tasha stood in front of the large glass windows of her new office, watching the city move below her. The lights of the buildings reflected off the glass, creating a web of motion and color that felt worlds away from the small diner where it had all begun. The office was a far cry from the greasy countertops and cramped booths she had spent years behind. It was quiet, modern, and full of purpose, a place where change could actually happen. And now it was hers. She had been working at the nonprofit for 3 months now, and in that time she had seen the difference one voice, one person could make. The cases, the people, the stories she had heard. It was overwhelming at times, but it had also given her a deep sense of fulfillment. Every day, she spoke to people who had faced the same things she had. Every day, she helped guide them toward justice. And every day, she knew that this was where she was supposed to be. But it wasn't just about the work, it was about the change that had come with it. It was about the way the town had started to look at itself differently after her case. The conversations that had once been whispered were now being shouted. The people who had once turned away were now standing up. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing. And Tasha knew that she had played a part in that. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath as she looked at the small plaque on her desk that read, Community Outreach Coordinator. It felt surreal, like a dream she hadn't known she could dream. It wasn't just a job title. It was a reflection of everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, and everything she was still determined to change. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a text message from Jake. How's everything going at the non-profit? You settling in? Tasha smiled as she typed her response. It's been incredible. I'm finally doing what I was meant to do. Helping people who've been through what I went through. It feels like I'm making a real difference. She hit send and leaned back again, allowing herself a moment of peace. She was grateful for Jake's support. He had been a constant throughout everything, not just as her lawyer, but as a mentor, a friend. Without him, she wasn't sure she would have had the courage to take the first step to fight back. And now, with the non-profit, she was carrying that same fire forward. But it wasn't just about making a living or a career. It was about creating a legacy. As Tasha drove home later that evening, she passed the diner. It was a strange sensation, seeing the familiar building, the one that had held so many memories, now sitting silent and abandoned. The neon sign that had once buzzed with life was dark. The windows were covered in dust. The whole place had an air of finality about it. Tasha hadn't been back since the trial, and though part of her still held a sense of ownership over the place, after all, she had spent so many years there, it felt like it was no longer hers to claim. The diner had been a chapter in her life, but it was one she was leaving behind. And that was okay. She slowed as she approached the old parking lot, glancing at the graffiti that now marked the side of the building. It was a stark reminder of how much things had changed. But as she drove past, she saw something that made her pause. A small group of people standing in front of the diner, holding signs. It wasn't a protest. It was something else. Curious, she parked across the street and stepped out of the car, walking toward them. As she got closer, she saw the signs clearly. Justice for all. We stand with Tasha. End discrimination. A wave of emotion hit her. Pride, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. The people weren't just there for her. They were there for themselves. They were part of the same fight she had started. They were the ones who had felt the same pain, who had been through the same struggles, and now they were standing together. The town had finally come together to say enough was enough. Hey! One of the people in the group called to her, a woman with a bright smile. You're Tasha, right? You're the one who stood up to that diner. Tasha nodded, her throat tight. Yeah, that's me. We just wanted to thank you, the woman said. You gave us a voice. You made us believe that we could stand up too. The words hit Tasha like a wave. She blinked quickly, trying to clear the moisture from her eyes. I didn't do it for the thanks, she said softly, her voice rough with emotion. I did it because we all deserve better. And we're all in this together. The woman nodded. And now we're making sure this town never forgets that. Tasha stood there for a moment, her heart swelling with pride. She knew in that instant that her fight had been worth it. The people standing in front of her, the ones who had come together, the ones who had taken up the cause, they were her legacy. It wasn't just about winning a case. It wasn't about exposing the wrongs done to her or getting back at the people who had hurt her. It was about creating something bigger than herself, a movement, community, force for change. As the group gathered around her, sharing stories and plans for the future, Tasha felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had started this fight alone, but now she wasn't alone anymore. She had built something that would live beyond her. And that was the real victory. When she left the group, she knew that she had done what she was meant to do. She had given everything she had, fought for the truth, and in the process, had ignited a fire that would continue to burn long after she was gone. Tasha drove home that night with a quiet smile on her face, the weight of the past finally lifting. The legacy she had built was only just beginning, but it would last far beyond the walls of the diner, beyond the courtroom, and beyond her own story. It was a legacy of hope, of resilience, and of the power of one voice to spark real change. And for the first time in her life, Tasha felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.